Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. Thank you for joining me again. I'm very pleased to have as my guest today, Alan C. Logan. He is an award-winning author, historian, and social commentator. His books include Self-Styled, Chasing Dr. Robert Vernon Spears. It is a historical nonfiction mystery from 1959. The book he is here to talk about today is called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Catching Truth While We Can. Great to have you here. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate the invite, Eric. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you.
Yeah. So let's start with this. Tell us how you became involved in putting this book together.
Yeah, sure. So kind of in a strange way, I had written the book, which you noted, Self-Styled, Chasing Dr. Robert Vernon Spears, who was a medical con man. He took on the role as a physician in Dallas, which he successfully pulled off for about a decade. And prior to that, had about 4 decades worth of various swindles. He was an imposter, married a society woman in San Francisco, and on and on. So some of the reviewers of the book started to bring up the name of Frank, Catch Me If You Can, Abagnale. And we're making comparisons. So I just wanted to be well informed so I could have an intelligent conversation about it. And I started to look into Abagnale's many claimed scams and his imposter roles that he purportedly had, and so on and so forth. And what was really mysterious to me is that none of them were properly documented, really at all. And that was strange because most of the so-called great imposters over the years, Spears being one, left a massive trail of newspaper clippings and forensics and court documents, police records and stuff. So, you kind of know what you're doing in that sense. You can put the jigsaw puzzle together. And Abagnale essentially had none of that. So I just said, okay, I need to do a deeper dive. And in brief, what really kind of cracked open my interest in earnest was through Genealogy Bank. So a lot of people know about newspapers.com or newspaperarchives.com as a way to, if you have an account with them, you can, see what's what, generally speaking, with a pretty broad scope of newspaper clippings, dating back into the late 1800s. But Genealogy Bank has a wide selection of newspapers that are not covered by those other major media banks. And they had a tiny little article, this thumbnail size, from 1969, making note of a guy by the name of Frank Abagnale that was arrested on Valentine's Day, February 14th of 1969. And what he was charged with wasn't really in line with what his claimed 5 years on the run, being chased by the FBI and everything else that most people who are familiar with either the film or his autobiography would know. So that's when I knew, okay, now there's some things not adding up. We need to dig deeper.
So your publisher included in the materials they sent me a timeline, which was quite helpful. Seeing the claims Abagnale makes versus the records that you have been able to dig up. It's broken down into different sections of his young life, a life that those of us who have seen the film are very familiar with. The pilot, the doctor, the lawyer, and the professor. So I'd love it if you could address what he says happened versus what really happened. But maybe before we even go there, we can start with Frank Abagnale's early life, truth versus fiction.
Yeah, so I guess we can approach this in 2 ways. And I think focusing in on the movie, which was based on his own autobiography, and I think we'll set the table in case someone hasn't seen the movie, but many have. And as you pointed out, his life is structured in various ways. But the viewer gets to understand that as a young person, a teenager, as they tend to position it, he had dressed as a Pan Am pilot for a couple of years, had worked in a Georgia hospital as a supervising physician, was a lawyer, but not just any lawyer, that he was an assistant state attorney general in Baton Rouge for almost a year, according to his own words, and also that he was a 2-semester PhD professor at Brigham Young University. All of these things are things that Abagnale himself has claimed, because it's important to recognize that even before the book was published, which was an international bestseller, it sold millions of copies, that for the 3 years prior to the publication of his book, Mr. Abagnale was going from podium to podium with a wild, wild story. So it's not plausible for him to say that his co-author, Stan Redding, and we can talk about him in a moment, kind of made all this up, because there is a multitude of evidence, including Mr. Abagnale's own press kit, which was published years before the book came out, where he was laying out that remarkable biography of a 16-year-old that ran away from home, traveled the world on Pan Am's dime for 2 years, then worked in a Georgia hospital for almost 1 year, then worked as an assistant state attorney general for almost another year, capped it off with 2 semesters at BYU, and then said he was going to retire to France, which we can get to. That's the biography that he laid in front of us. And going back again to his early life, he claimed, and as he still claims, in fact, I would encourage anyone that's listening to your wonderful podcast to go to his talks at Google. This is so famous. It's been viewed over 12 million times. And he kind of lays out in his talks at Google his early life, where he claims that at 16, he suddenly found out his parents were getting a divorce and he ran away from home. And the rest is kind of laid out as I just now mentioned. So let's get back to what actually happened then. His parents did divorce. They divorced when he was 15 years old. And in fact, his father remarried a secretary at a local TV station outside of New York when he was 15 years old. And there's no question that would certainly be traumatic, and can't make light of that. So it was a difficult thing for him, to be sure. From there, we know that he joined the United States Navy. This is something, to my knowledge, Mr. Abagnale has never publicly talked about. I'm presuming because if you're claiming that you ran away from home at 16 years old and became a Pan Am pilot, it kind of interferes with the narrative that he was in the United States Navy, documented between 1964 and 1965. So now in the spring of 1965, at 17 years old, Mr. Abagnale steals a car, a Ford Mustang, and we can say he did because he conceded on federal court paperwork that he did, even though ultimately, as we'll get to, they dropped the charges, but he did sign paperwork conceding that he had taken the car. He stole blank checks from a service area on the Bronx River Parkway, just north of New York City, and used those blank checks to travel from New York to California by car. So he took this Ford Mustang with him and found his way into the sleepy town of Eureka, California with the Mustang. Officials were suspicious. He went into a local bank. The bank officials were suspicious of him. Again, he's 17 years old at this point, and they called the local police. And what's really amazing about this is that Eureka, California, at the time, in 1965, was home to one of the most famous, let's call them catchers of paper hangers, or someone that's really proficient at being able to spot forgeries. This is in the local police department in Humboldt County in California. So because he had all of, this is the police official, a local police official, he had everybody really well trained on how to spot con men, forgers, swindlers, and they did. And so in contrast to Mr. Abagnale's claimed autobiography, and his many discussions since in his press kit, he was arrested in Eureka, California, because they realized he was up to no good. The FBI did get involved because he had driven the stolen car over state lines. So that's why the FBI got involved. And it's in the newspaper. There's actually a photograph of the 17-year-old Abagnale sitting in the back of the police cruiser being interviewed. It's in the Humboldt Times Standard. So Abagnale, who was claimed that he never saw his dad again after he ran away from home at 16 years old, that's not true, because his dad, Frank Sr., flew out to California to pick him up and bring him back to New York. The federal government decided they were going to try the stolen car charges back in his home state in New York. It was agreed upon. It's all in the federal court records. You actually can see it documented in the court records that Abagnale's father, Frank Sr., went out, brought him back. They felt sorry for him at this point. His dad does not have a lot of money, and they made the bail money set at just a $1 bill because they had empathy for the father. Goes back to New York. Again, just to keep on with the timeline, it's the spring of 1965. He's only back literally a couple of weeks, if that. And the local police had been on the lookout for him because they want to get him for stealing the blank checks from the service station on the Bronx River Parkway. And indeed, about 2 weeks after he was brought back from California to face the federal charges for the stolen car, the Tuckahoe, New York Police Department got their man. And they got a tip that he was going to be visiting a local dry cleaner. And when he showed up, the Tuckahoe Police Department arrested him for the stolen check charges. And there begins, he was found guilty of that really quickly. And there begins a 3-year sentence at the Great Meadow Prison in Comstock, New York. Now, this becomes really the smoking gun that implodes the entire narrative of running around the world as a teenage millionaire imposter on Pan Am's dime. And again, we go back to the press kits. We go back to all 3 years worth of the telling of this tale between 1977 and 1980, the years preceding the publication of his autobiography, where he was making these wild claims. So he's in Comstock, sentenced to 3 years. He does get paroled in 1967, but he's quickly rearrested in Boston, Massachusetts, just a couple of weeks later. He's picked up by the Massachusetts State Police on stolen car charges, once again, and a small larceny by check, less than $100. He's found guilty on both charges. He serves about 4 months in Boston, spends it in the Charles Street Jail, and he's returned right back to the Great Meadow Prison in Comstock, New York, for the parole violation. Abagnale would later go on the Johnny Carson show and tell an incredible tale about how he had built the Massachusetts State Police, made them look like fools. He said that he had talked the Massachusetts State Police into carrying a massive box, a metal box with probably thousands and thousands of dollars worth of people's safety deposit money or company's safety deposit money and stuff like that. Well, this was told on Johnny Carson show, and that was the tripwire for an investigative journalist who just didn't, that tale didn't sit easy with an investigative journalist. And we can return to that because it's a really important part of how the truth was discovered, or put another way, where the hoax of his biography unraveled. But let's go back to, he's returned to Comstock, New York for the stolen car and the low-level check larceny in Boston. He's in Comstock. He finally gets released at his full sentence amount, which is December 24th, 1968. He is now 20 years old. Okay, so again, let's keep the claims in mind, keep the age. He's now an adult at this point. He's released from Comstock, and literally days later, he somehow gets a TWA Airlines uniform. And he finds his way on to a flight between New York and Miami, Florida. He's in this case now, so some of the truth, there's always a lot of grains of truth to a lot of the tale. So you can see he did indeed dress as a co-pilot. He did indeed get a jump seat authorization to get on that flight. But what was special about getting on that flight is the woman who was the flight attendant, called stewardesses back in the day, is a woman by the name of Paula Parks, who's a central part of the story and the unraveling of the hoax. Really, to me, in my opinion, the central piece, because her story is remarkable. Everything that Paula Parks told me was backed up by records in the Baton Rouge Police Department, as well as the court records in Baton Rouge. So this is what happened. Abagnale gets on the flight from New York to Miami in and around January 1st, 1969. He's 20 years old. On that flight down, about halfway down towards Miami, the flight attendants, again, I think it's okay to call them stewardesses at this point to gain the flavor, the time, and the environment. And Abagnale starts having a chat with them, and he's funny, he's engaging, and they're having a good laugh. And that was that. He asks Paula out to go for some dinner when they get down to Miami, but it's really late. It's a night flight. It's arriving late. She wanted no part of it, and he was he really put a full court press on to try to get her to do it. So she conceded, and she said, "Well, it's only if someone else goes." So she went with one of her colleagues from Delta Airlines. Sorry, I should have said that Paula's a Delta Airlines stewardess. So the two of them, Paula, her colleague, and then joined by Frank, they go out. They end up finding a hot dog place. It was the only thing that was open. They have some laughs, have some hot dogs, go back to the hotel. The two women, Abagnale goes on his own way. That's where the story, you might think, ends. The next morning when Paula wakes up, the room light on the push-button phone is flashing. She's got a message down at front desk. So she goes down there. She was a little concerned. She thought something might be up. Why she get a message to go down to front desk that there's something there for her? And there's a massive bouquet of roses, pounds of chocolates, and so on, and a message from Frank. And he says, "Let's go out to lunch," which, again, because he was somewhat charming, Paula agreed to, but only in the presence of her colleague. They do that. They have some lunch, and they're going their separate ways, and he wants her contact information. And she really wanted no part of it. And this is the really important part of the story. She was really reluctant to give out her phone number at her own home, which was in New Orleans. Her parents live in Baton Rouge. So she does that and instantly felt like her heart dropped, like she shouldn't have done it. But in any case, they part ways, and that's that. Well, wouldn't you know it, over the next few days, Abagnale, the guy dressing up as the TWA pilot, starts showing up at her work locations, places where her flight runs were ending. So somehow or another, the man in the costume was using false pretenses to find his way to where her workday would be ending. She tried to make it clear that she wasn't interested, and he was persistent. At one point, he was waiting for her as she finished work with a big bouquet of plastic roses, which I thought was somewhat amusing. And I'm just trying to picture, where did he get them from? Are they taken from a cemetery? I'm not sure. Paula was always curious about that and smiles a bit about it and has a laugh. From there, Paula says, "Look, I've got work to do. I'm not going out with you." And that's that. And she went home by herself and made it clear. But once again, he shows up to other places, and ultimately he shows up to her apartment in New Orleans. She gets uncomfortable. She says, "Listen, I'm on my way out down to Baton Rouge to see my parents. I've got things to do." And he said, "Oh, I'll drive you down there. I'll drive you down there." So she figured, okay, this might be an opportunity to make it abundantly clear, I'm not interested in this guy. So they drive down there. Abagnale's got a big, massive Chevrolet Impala convertible, even though it was January, the weather was cooperating, and they drove down to Baton Rouge. go to Paula Parks' parents' house, John Bud Parks and his wife, Charlotte. They have a bit of lunch. Abagnale is extremely charming and really pours it on with the parents. They're having a good time. Paula is telling her parents on the side that she's absolutely not interested in this guy at all. But they seem to really like him. The mother happens to mention, hey, if you're ever back one day in Baton Rouge, I'll take you for fishing lessons. And that was it. They parted ways. Paula then didn't hear anything, and she thought, okay, this guy's got the message now. But he shows up at Paula's parents' house in Baton Rouge on his own, days later. And he said, hey, remember me? Paula's friend? I'm here for the fishing lessons. Paula's parents invite him in and seem charming. Lunch leads to dinner, leads to him staying with Paula's parents. They cut a key for him. The mother, according to her own testimony in newspapers, cooked dinner for him, took care of him. So now he's saying he's a furloughed pilot and he wants a job working with kids in the area. So they introduce him to a local reverend. Paula, who's busy and she's traveling with Delta from city to city, finds out later that this guy, Abagnale, is living in her parents' house. And on top of that, he's actually in Paula's own childhood bedroom. So this whole thing starts to take on a really creepy air to it. Paula is telling the parents, look, I'm not into this guy. I'm not going to go down to Baton Rouge so long as he's there. If you think he's charming, I don't. And I don't want to give this guy the wrong impression. So he stays at the parents' house. The local reverend who he befriended tried to introduce him to some people at Louisiana State University, LSU, locally. He told them he had a master's degree from Cornell University in social work. But they quickly determined that he didn't know anything about social work. He hadn't the foggiest notion about it. And they realized he was a phony. And they told the reverend so. So the reverend is now suspicious, and he calls up to New Orleans, where TWA's local regional headquarters are. And immediately they're like, yeah, we know about this guy. He's been hanging around, the different airports. He's a phony, and he's been a bit of a nuisance. So, and they had been collecting the places that Abagnale had been going to because they knew him. This wasn't a case where this guy was, he was slippery, as a Vaseline goat, as he claimed. They had been documenting the places that he went to. So once the Reverend hears this, he calls the Baton Rouge Police Department. Abagnale was quickly arrested on February 14th, 1969. So just about 6 to 7 weeks after he was released from Comstock, New York prison. So again, not compatible with someone that was roaming the world, cashing checks everywhere from Bangkok to Sao Paulo. It never happened. But when he's arrested in Baton Rouge, the police come to find out that he had been stealing while staying in the Parks family home. He had been rifling through, found their checkbooks, took blank checks. And the kicker is, this is testimony from John Parks, Bud, as he was known, that's Paula's father, that he was taking him, the father, out to dinner. And he was also purchasing a bouquet of flowers for the mother as a note of appreciation on their own checks. So this guy who has claimed publicly that he never once, in his words, never ever bilked and ripped off an individual or small mom and pop stores, small businesses. This is what he was arrested and ultimately convicted for. He was convicted eventually in June of 1969 in Baton Rouge and was sentenced to about 12 years. Now, while he was in prison, the reverend, the aforementioned reverend, has some sympathy for him, thinks Abagnale's a lost soul, and goes to bat to try to avert a long sentence for Abagnale. Try to avert him from going to prison, basically. And if he had gone to prison, Angola prison at the time was one of the worst prisons in the United States. So in June of 1969, Abagnale found himself in front of a guy called Mickey Parker, who was known as the hanging judge. And because of the Reverend's good words, Abagnale was given probation and psychiatric treatment as his sentencing, as well as restitution to the victim. Because in letters that Paula kept all those years, letters that I've seen, letters that I discuss in the book, you can see Abagnale putting on a full-on charm offensive, trying to convince the Reverend that the only thing that he wants more than anything else is just some psychiatric treatment, and then he'll be good. I mean, he wrote to the Reverend, and he underscored it 3 times. I beg for it, he told the Reverend. Just get me the psychiatric treatment. Now, for listeners who might be familiar with the activities of con men, I'll ask a rhetorical question. Do we think once he was sentenced to psychiatric treatment in the area and given probation instead, did he hang around the area and get that psychiatric treatment? Well, we know the answer is no. From there, Abagnale does go to Sweden, where he victimized 2 families there. Similar circumstances, befriended a local family, stole from them, was ultimately convicted of that in Sweden, and then also in France as well. And he basically did the same thing. He convinced a local man in Sweden, a guy called Jan Hillman, to let him take a car on loan, never paid him for it, and he took that car and he drove it down to Montpellier, France, where he was ultimately stuck out like a sore thumb because it had Swedish plates. And he was arrested in France, served 4 months in Perpignan prison outside of Montpellier, and then was extradited up to Sweden. He was only sentenced to 2 months, but he fought the sentencing not because of the 2 months, because clearly that's so lenient. I mean, consider he essentially did the same thing in Baton Rouge and was given 12 years for it, whereas in Sweden he was given 2 months. So we can clearly see the difference between 2 criminal justice systems. But Abagnale actually appealed the sentence because the sentence was deportation out of Sweden, and he didn't want to be deported. He said that he loved Sweden and wanted to stay there. The Swedish judges disagreed with him and ordered him deported by June of 1970, which he was. Now he's back in the States, and now the rest of this story is going to sound really familiar to anyone who might be familiar with the movie, might be familiar with the many claims and the many YouTube videos that Mr. Abagnale has presented. In this late summer of 1970, he gets a hold of a Pan Am uniform and cashes. What he did was, now this is the tripwire that put him onto the radar of the FBI, finally. And we know that the FBI was not chasing this guy all over the world, because in 1969, in the first third of the year in 1969, you can see federal court paperwork basically abandoning his 1965 stolen car charges. Imagine, that went on for about 4 years, but they realized he was in custody in New York during that time. And eventually they said, hey, look, you know what? This is years old. He's been in Comstock. Let's just let it go. But when they did that in 1969, you can see in the federal court paperwork, they were not hunting for him. They're not looking for him and all the rest of it. But let's get back to the summer of 1970, late summer. He took a personal check, stuck the Pan Am decal on it, and dressed it up as a Pan Am paycheck, simply by putting that logo on. Some of this has been in the National Archives. Again, I'd like to point out, not because it's special, not because this was some kind of significant crime. It wasn't. Just that's where all federal crime paperwork ultimately ends up. And if you do your homework, you can actually gain access and obtain this. So there was one copy of the check. It's rudimentary. It's a personal check, as I said, with an American eagle and some flags on it. And it's in his name. That's the other thing. It's a great myth that he ran around the world using all kinds of aliases. Abagnale committed his crimes in his own name, in Baton Rouge, in Sweden, and this period I'm about to share with you, and ultimately in Friendswood, Texas, which we can get to as well. He typed up these Pan Am checks in his own name, calling himself first officer, Frank Abagnale. So he cashed the first one at the end of July in Durham, North Carolina. Most of these were for small amounts. And then he spaced it out. He didn't really go too hard on these. He spaced the checks out. He hit up Dallas, a couple of checks in Houston, Tucson, a couple in California, and then he went a little heavy in Provo, Utah. He cashed 10 of these checks over that 3-month period. And Provo, he was hitting up small businesses like Hale's Camera. I've spoken to the proprietor. The proprietor, Ernest Hales, has since passed, but his family is still alive. I've spoken with them. Again, this just belies the notion that he never ever ripped an individual off or a small business. Pilgrim Dry Cleaner in Houston, another target. So you can sort of see the pattern. After the 3 checks in Provo, he's now, the FBI looking for him at this point, because the big difference is this. If someone's cashing a check locally in Baton Rouge, it's a matter of the Baton Rouge Police Department. But the checks on Pan Am, because they were written as Pan Am checks, ultimately made their way to Pan Am. It took a couple of weeks for that to happen, but these 10 checks were going to make their way to Pan Am. And of course, they're going to look, no, this guy doesn't work for us. And that's exactly what happened. So he put himself onto the radar of the FBI. And this 3-month period and the 10 Pan Am checks becomes the basis of what most people would know in the Catch Me If You Can film. So really, that's the rub. That's the grains of truth. And there always is some. Ultimately, Abagnale was caught on November 2nd of 1970. He was arrested. He pled guilty to the 10 Pan Am checks. Everything was handled in Atlanta, Georgia. And he was sentenced to 10 years. Now, for many years, Abagnale claimed that he escaped the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. It's in his press kit. It's in many, many, many of the newspaper articles that even preceded his autobiography. It was one of the things that he laid claim to. That never happened. Abagnale was never in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. He was, however, held in the Cobb County Jail, which is a local jail in the 1970s, did not have adequate security. Local jails were not, I'm not saying this happened every single day, but any historian would know that local jails were not the most secure places, and escapes were fairly routine throughout the United States. While deputies were doing paperwork, Abagnale slipped out the door. This is the period of time between his arrest on November 2nd and his final pleading guilty and sentencing. That escape happened in February of 1971. He was quickly rearrested. He tried to cash another Pan Am check in New York City. That didn't go well. He was immediately picked up by the NYPD, and that also has been noted in the historical record. So he did have a brief escape, and then he was transferred back down to the Fulton County Jail in Atlanta, ultimately sentenced. He serves a few years, and he's granted parole in February of 1974. Just backing up for just one thing, because there's another component of this that people will know well. It was featured in the movie, and that was Abagnale's recruitment effort at 2 places, the University of Arizona and Arizona State University. Investigative journalist Ira Perry of the Daily Oklahoman in 1978, after seeing Abagnale's press kit, and Abagnale was about to give some talks around Oklahoma City, and Ira Perry was a rookie journalist, and he took a look at the press kit, and I think, I wasn't there, but I can just imagine him shaking his head and saying, I got to look at this. He's fresh out of Texas Tech University with a journalism degree. And he just systematically, one by one by one by one, starts going after all of Abagnale's claims. He's calling up the Cobb County General Hospital, where Abagnale claimed he was a supervising pediatrician for a year. He contacted the Baton Rouge State Attorney General's office. He contacted Brigham Young University. Everybody was denying it across the board. And Ira Perry in the Daily Oklahoman just did an absolutely brutal takedown of all of the claims. And I would encourage anybody to try to look for that. Some of it, NPR recently put some of it on their website, it's just something to see. I mean, honestly, journalists have received Pulitzers for less than what Perry did in terms of just a sheer devastating debunking from top to bottom. And ultimately, when that was published in the Daily Oklahoman, Abagnale canceled his talks in the area. So that happened in 1978. But among Perry's reporting, he investigated this notion of this recruitment, because in Abagnale's press kit, he was making the claim that the recruitment of these young co-eds under the guise of, hey, you're all going to be Pan Am stewardesses along with me for the summer months. They wanted to know if it was true. He put it in the press kit. Abagnale said he did it, and he did it for 4 months. He toured Europe with all these women that he had recruited in Arizona. So Ira Perry contacted the folks down there, and they quickly debunked it. He did try it, to be sure. He was able to gather, all told, about a dozen women. The problem for him, and they quickly started to figure out, look, this guy's it's just not right. One of the people that showed up to this recruitment effort was actually a guy, a mature student by the name of Paul Holson. He happened to have a commercial airline pilot's license, and he was looking for a Pan Am position. Again, this is happening in the autumn of 1970. So Holson shows up. Again, this is according to Holson's memoirs. Holson has written memoirs called Born in a Bottle of Beer, and he recounts this. And he says, yeah, this guy was doing some recruitment, and Holson shows up, and he said that his presence there seemed to startle Abagnale, because he's like, hey, I'm recruiting women here. What are you doing here? And ultimately, Holson was interviewed by the authorities as well. So Perry was able to uncover that this never happened, that there was the recruitment effort was made, and that's kind of, another thing that was debunked along the way. Now Abagnale is getting released. He's on parole, and despite his claims when Catch Me If You Can, the film was released, Abagnale did a special appearance, and it's part of a special 2-disc CD when it's released, and he was doing all this press. And Abagnale said that when he was released on parole in 1974, that he had never been to Houston before, and that's where he was sent. But that's a lie. He had been in Houston before. In fact, that's where he ripped off the Pilgrim Dry Cleaners, a family-run business, in 1970. So Abagnale makes his way to Houston when he's paroled. He had been there before. We have no doubt about that. And he claims that he went to Houston to work for the FBI. Now, there's no way to prove or disprove that. And, people ask and people want to know, to me, what he has done or hasn't done with the FBI is of little concern to me. It's just not of interest to me. What's interesting to me is, how does all of the things that he has said about his biography, again, he has said, not what Steven Spielberg has said, but what he has said, line up with the facts? That's all. So, and then people can kind of, it's not for me to ask your listeners to, everyone's welcome to make up their own minds. You can still love the film and just understand that it's fiction. So he's in Houston. His claims of working for the FBI. And again, we don't know. But what we do know is that he once again decides he's going to go and work with children, as he wanted to do in Baton Rouge. So in the summer of 74, he goes down to a children's camp called Camp Madison in Friendswood, Texas, which is not far from Houston. It's actually right in the shadow of NASA's Mission Control. And it's a beloved place. In fact, Buzz Aldrin, sent his own kids there. And this is just for the camp life that kind of, in the mythology of mid-century America, and right through really to the 80s, before a lot of these beloved camps started falling apart. Camp Madison was beloved. So Abagnale shows up there, it's the kind of place you have horseback riding and archery and lakes and swimming and all sorts, trips to NASA. And the kids there would be boarders. They ranged in age, but most of them were boarders, but there was also kids that would commute back and forth. So they needed transportation back to Houston and elsewhere. So Abagnale goes down to Camp Madison offering his services. He tells the proprietor, Tom Madison, beloved by the community, stickler for safety, by all accounts a wonderful person. He shows up there in his uniform. He says he's a Delta pilot on furlough, and not just any Delta pilot. He said he's like a union boss, part of the airline fraternity. But he says he's furloughed. Now that doesn't raise a red flag because that year, some pilots in various airlines had been furloughed. The difference was, and this is important, but Delta was the only airline that did not furlough its pilots in the summer of '74. Well, we'll get to why that's important in a moment. So he's in the office with Tom Madison saying, hey, look, I'm furloughed. I'm looking for a gig. You got anything for me? Tom says, listen, I can make you a go for maybe drive the bus around. I need someone to drive the kids who commute back to their homes. Now let's just step back for a second. This guy's just paroled out of the federal prison in Virginia. He's now going to be driving kids around Houston, pretending to be a furloughed pilot. So Madison gives him a job, and Abagnale befriends some of the camp counselors. You can see the group of this. There's a photo, again, you can see it on the greatesthoax.com website. It's out and about. It's in various videos. But Abagnale's actually photographed with all the other camp counselors. And he's in his little green Camp Madison t-shirt. He's in the top right-hand corner of that photograph. I ended up interviewing quite a few of his camp counselor mates, because clearly he worked with them in the summer of '74. So, and they had interesting stories to tell. Abagnale kind of befriended them. One of the things that Tom Madison had for commuting the children around was a big, long checker limousine, known as an airporter back in the day. For anyone familiar with Catch Me If You Can, there's a famous scene where Leonardo DiCaprio gets out of one of those long stretch checker limousines with a bevy of women on each side of him. In reality, Abagnale was driving one of those checkered limousines, commuting around. That's what they used in the daytime. But at nighttime, according to several of the campers that I spoke to, he was taking the camp counselors out for nights on the town. And everyone was having a grand old time, and we're wondering, where's the guy getting all the money to take everybody out? In addition to that, what's, I guess, somewhat amusing in some circles would be that Tom Madison, a lot of the vehicles at Camp Madison were purchased at Texas Corrections. So they were former prison buses. And Abagnale would be driving around, and they still had the bars on them. Abagnale was driving around retooled prison buses with the bars on them. And for some of the camp counselors who were adults now and look back on this with a bit of a smile and a chuckle, that is not lost on them. So he's going out on the town, splashing the money, picking things up in a credit card. But come to find out, Tom Madison starts to suspect something's not right. But in the meantime, one of the women that did not like Abagnale at all, was really put off by him, and just had this creepy feeling, was a woman by the name of Jan Jackson. Now, Jan Jackson, as chance would have it, her father was a real Delta Airlines pilot. Jan Jackson calls her father. First, she writes to her father right in the beginning. She's like, wow, this is really strange. This guy's saying he's a furloughed Delta pilot. She writes to her father, old school, pops it in the mail. The dad's like, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know Delta furloughed anybody. I'll look into this. But this took some time. It wasn't because they thought, there wasn't any alarm bells per se at that point. But the dad did look into him and says, hey, this guy's making this stuff up. As chance would have it, when Jan Jackson is finding out that Abagnale is not a real Delta pilot, Tom Madison starts to suspect that money is missing. He starts to suspect that Abagnale has been stealing from the camp. And one of the camp counselors, Morris Fusilier, was potentially one of the victims. So Madison and Morris Fusilier become the complainants, and they press charges. And that course dragged on, and ultimately Abagnale was ruled. It was ruled to be guilty and had to pay them restitution. From there, Abagnale is so he's this. I'm not. It's difficult to say with certainty what happened, but it appears that the judge was really lenient and only ordered the restitution. But we know what happened next because Abagnale's own parole officer, Jim Blackman, he told a local newspaper in Texas that after that, he took over as Abagnale's parole officer. And when a period of time went by, he gets a call from Abagnale and says, "Hey, you're going to be really pleased. I've landed a job working in an orphanage as the recreation director." So once again, he's going to a place with vulnerable children. Blackman, again, there's a lot of crazy coincidences in this story. Blackman realizes, wait a minute, you got a job as the recreation director. Blackman, as chance would have it, used to be the superintendent of this very orphanage. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So he says, what are you talking about? I used to be the superintendent of that orphanage, and you need a master's degree to do what you're doing. I'm on my way over there. So now Abagnale realizes the jig is up, and he tells Blackman over the phone. All this is what Blackman has reported to the newspaper. So this is not like me speculating. He's told reporters. So Blackman is now on his way over. He says, "Hey, I'm coming over there right now." So Abagnale then says he realizes the jig is up, and he says, "Look, I'm not just the recreation director. I'm placing children into foster homes." So then,
oh my goodness.
Then Blackman says, "Now I'm really on my way over there." So he goes over to the orphanage, and he finds Abagnale ensconced in the place with a nice office with photos of himself in pilot uniform. And Blackman does not identify who made up his phony master's degree, but only acknowledges that a local student had made up Abagnale a phony master's degree and credentials. So he was removed from that position. And then after that, he lands a legit job as a claims investigator for Aetna locally in Houston, but he has to go up to Connecticut, to Hartford, Connecticut, for training, mandatory Aetna training. While he's there, he cashes 4 checks on the Aetna premises. So he even put the name of the course instructors on the backs of the checks to make it all look legit. Now, of course, it'll be no shock to the listeners. Those checks bounce. Now, Aetna chooses this, by the way, just for the time frame. Now we're into 1975 at this point. Okay. And keep in mind that Abagnale has maintained publicly with great conviction that when he was paroled, he went to work for the FBI. Aetna decides not to press criminal charges, but they weren't going to let it go. So we'll get to the outcome in a second. But now time is going on. It takes them ages to they're doing it civilly through civil court measures. So now Abagnale, 1976, Abagnale hangs out his own shingle, and he starts to construct this grand biography that we all know today. And in January of 1977, he goes and he does his first public gig at a Chamber of Commerce event in Galveston County. And it's like he's shot out of a cannon. No one knows where he came from. I mean, the people in the community. But the previous year, their annual Chamber of Commerce event was a slideshow about beautiful pictures from the area. Now, all of a sudden, 1 year later, it's January of 77, and this guy has got a hell of a tale, and people were believing it. There was a small article in the local paper. Now Abagnale saying he traveled the world. He said he cashed as many as 2,000 Pan Am checks because he said that's how many model kits he purchased to dress up the checks, so we can infer that. He also has this wild, wild tale where when he was arriving back from Sweden, the jetliner is taxiing on the runway, and Abagnale finds somehow, some way, he's able to find his way through the toilet bowl and out through the bottom of the airplane and onto the tarmac, climbs a fence, just so happens to wave down a cab and on the Van Wyck Expressway, and away he's in the wind. This is his claim. Now, of course, that's not true. And if we fast forward to this talks at Google, Abagnale's queried about this. This is just recently, just a couple of years ago. He's now viewed over 12 million times. And Abagnale is queried about the escape through the toilet, because in the meantime, more recently, aeronautical engineers have confirmed that's an impossibility. So he tells the crowd, which is to say approximately 12 million people, that it wasn't Abagnale that had made that story up. It was, in fact, Steven Spielberg and the filmmakers. So you get to see how the embellishments go back. So let's go back now to Galveston County. As I said, he shot out of the circus cannon. Hell of a story. Everybody's loving it. And because it was so incredible, and it was in the papers, and then what happens is, because it's in the papers, it becomes a circular form of verification. It's in this paper, so it's got to be true. That was his ticket to get on To Tell the Truth. Now, any of your listeners can go and find the To Tell the Truth episode featuring Frank Abagnale on YouTube. It's been viewed over 1 million times. And you can see through the comments that, generally speaking, most people believe it to be true. And indeed, Steven Spielberg morphed that To Tell the Truth episode, some portions of it, and kind of blended in Leonardo DiCaprio, but did use some of the real footage from the original To Tell the Truth episode. So Abagnale goes on to tell the truth. And to my knowledge, it's the first time in the history of the show where all three of the contestants were lying, whereas it should be that only one of the people, the individuals, should be telling the complete, total, and honest truth, and the other two, of course, are fabricated. That's the nature of the show. most people know the rules to tell the truth. But on that show, Abagnale makes all of his bold claims. He was a physician. He was an attorney general. He escaped from the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And sure enough, to give him his dues, no one figured out that it was him. And that was the turning point of his career and his rocket. Really a rocket ship to stardom, because he went from To Tell the Truth to the Today Show, and then he got on Carson in April of 1978. But now, let's just take a second out to circle back to Aetna. Recall, these 4 checks, Aetna's hunting him down. So you can tell from the dates of when Aetna finally got a hold of him. He was giving some talk locally in Houston, and that's when they sued him to get their money back. And I don't know what the outcome of that is. You can only see that he was sued in Harris County in 1977, right around the time he was on To Tell the Truth. So you just imagine the scenario here. Aetna is a $1 billion company, but they're not letting these 4 checks go because they clearly appear to be irritated. And after To Tell the Truth, you can imagine, wait a minute, that's the guy that was in Hartford. But it didn't stop. And the tails just, to quote Oreo Speedwagon, just grew taller on down the line. He gets onto the Tonight Show, and anybody that's familiar with Johnny Carson, the Tonight Show is a kingmaker. If you're on the Tonight Show, your life is transformed, typically in a very financially beneficial way. And certainly we can, I think, make a safe assumption that was certainly the case, because it wasn't, that happened, as I said, in April 78. And now he starts to work his way towards getting his autobiography published. When the autobiography was published in 1980, he claimed that it was almost completely true. Then when the film came out in 2002, he started to back off from that. His co-author on the book, I think this is worth mentioning, because there's sometimes a little confusion about, because recently Abagnale has taken to saying, well, Stan Redding, the co-author on the autobiography, made some things up. He exaggerated some things. Abagnale doesn't say what those things are. He doesn't say whether or not Redding happened to maybe bypass the fact that Abagnale was in prison between the ages of 17 and 20, that he was in the U.S. Navy, that he had been arrested and convicted in Baton Rouge, that he indeed had taken advantage of people in Sweden and so forth. So you have just really an incredible autobiography, as it was labeled. And Stan Redding was a one-time good reporter at the Houston Chronicle. I mean, he was an award-winning reporter in his youth. I don't know what happened. All we can say is that he certainly did no deep journalistic rigor with regard to taking on the Abagnale case. Records show that Stan Redding, co-author of the book that was published in 1980, had been kind of working along with Abagnale much earlier than that. But the idea is, in the summer of 1977, and most people, if you go to Google, you type in Abagnale, you see there's a famous photograph of him in a Pan Am uniform. That photo was taken at Massey Studio in Provo. That was the cover story of the Houston Chronicle Sunday magazine in the summer of 1977. And again, that was another way to get this narrative supercharged. And we know that Redding did no investigative journalism whatsoever. We know that Redding didn't even do minimal journalistic efforts, because Ira Perry, who I mentioned from the Daily Oklahoman, with just a half-decent effort, was able to implode Abagnale's entire press kit. And lest we forget, because Stephen Hall of the San Francisco Chronicle deserves mention here too. Stephen Hall was actually the first journalist to really shred Abagnale's narrative. He actually did it a few months earlier in 1978, when Abagnale appeared on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson for his third time. And I think this was the last time Abagnale was ever on there looking Johnny Carson in the eyes, because after that appearance, the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle the next day, in October of 1978, the headline was, "Johnny has been conned." And then the subtitle was, "The Convict Who Makes Up Crimes." Because Stephen Hall had also, much like Ira Perry, these are solid journalists. These are journalists that did their work. And again, all you did do was make the phone calls and so on. They weren't able to determine where Abagnale was specifically. That was something that came my way because of the Parks family. But Ira Perry from the Daily Oklahoman and Stephen Hall from the San Francisco Chronicle had unspooled this as being a hoax in 1978. The problem is, as most listeners would know, this was the pre-digital era. Local reporting stayed local. And when you're on the Tonight Show and when you're hopping from podium to podium across North America, as Abagnale did really effectively, it's no match. So, it just went into the sort of the dustbin of history until the articles were digitized and made available. And then once you have the reporting from Stephen Hall and Ira Perry in 1978, and you start following those threads, and when you're able to get to the Parks family in Baton Rouge and realize what happened to that family and how they had to suffer. And I mean that. I've spoken with this family. The parents are now deceased, the true victims, but Paula herself, who was followed by Abagnale. I mean, you can imagine what it's like for this family who know the truth to constantly be reminded about what happened, essentially voiceless. They tried to tell people, no one would listen to them, especially when the movie came out, about what the real deal was. I mean, their family was victimized. That's not a dispute. That's not something you can debate. It's in the criminal record. The notion that he was an attorney general, assistant attorney general down in Baton Rouge, is just so beyond the pale. Even a minimal amount of journalism would show that to be untrue. The notion that, as he claimed, he passed the Louisiana State Bar exam on his third try, in his words, mind you, it was only offered every 6 months at the time, is beyond the pale. The National Enquirer was the first news outlet to start investigating the claims of Abagnale in the 1970s. once they heard this notion, but perhaps when he was on To Tell the Truth, where he says that he was a state attorney general in Baton Rouge. So they called the actual first assistant state attorney general, Ken DeJean, down in Baton Rouge. And they're like, hey, what's the story of this Abagnale? And they did a full investigation. They spent tremendous amounts of resources, time, and energy going through the roles. They reconciled every single person that took the Louisiana State Bar exam and reconciled them all and confirmed that no, he did not take and pass this exam under any name. Furthermore, they went back and they looked at every single person that ever worked in the state attorney general's office and were able to reconcile every single person. You could imagine how the effort and the time it takes to do this. So when Ken DeJean with the National Enquirer, he said, look, this guy is phony as a $3 bill. Ask him, this is what he told the National Enquirer, ask him these questions. And he gave the Enquirer about a half a dozen questions to ask Abagnale. What did the building look like? What floor was the offices on? But the best part of it is, ask Abagnale to describe Jack P.F. Gremion, the actual state attorney general. Ask him to describe what he looks like. First off, Abagnale couldn't pronounce his name. Abagnale at the time, he's corrected this, he's gotten wise to it, but Abagnale was calling him Gremillion. His name is Gremion. So right off the bat, he couldn't pronounce his name. But the best part of it is, Abagnale described him as being a little over 6 foot tall, slender, blonde hair. In reality, the actual state attorney general of Louisiana was 5'6", bald, and chunky. So the National Enquirer were like, they killed the story because they knew that it was garbage. But instead, Abagnale rose like a phoenix out of the ashes. The Parks family had to see this, and him being on national television saying he never ever ripped off any individual. So the reason I got into this, once I realized what had happened to them, I was committed to it. I was committed to go to tell this story, really on Paula's behalf. And you know, I'm not trying to show myself to be a virtuous person. I'm just stating why we're chatting right now. Because if this was merely about debunking a movie, I wouldn't have bothered. It's actually about telling the Parks family story, and you know what they've had to contend with. And readers of the book will see that there was somewhat of a reunion that happened between Paula Parks and Frank Abagnale in Baton Rouge when Abagnale rolled into town just literally a couple of weeks before the pandemic began in 2020. He happened to be on getting a reported $20,000 fee to speak and regale a lunchtime crowd in Baton Rouge. And that's where Paula Parks showed up to meet the man who had once invaded their family. So that to me is a really interesting part of the story as well.
Yeah, for sure. What's complicated here is that there are multiple layers of deception going on, right? There's the truth about his real life. There are his own embellishments, further exaggerated, according to him, by the publisher of his book. And then the movie changes things even more. It's almost like a game of telephone, right?
So true, Eric. It really is a game of telephone all down the line. And, you know, and you're right. And I think one of the things that Abagnale has done over the years, and there's just so many YouTube videos, it's not just the talks at Google, right? So the talks at Google I've mentioned several times because 12 million views, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean 12 million people have viewed it, but we know it's a heck of a lot of people throughout the world. And you look at the comments underneath and you see people that are just glowing about the idea that this man passed the bar exam and so forth. But there are things that are said in there that are so incredible. Like he says that in the video that he was arrested only once in his life. Now, that is really, to me, among many, there's falsehoods throughout the video. I mean, there's just no point in me going cataloging them at this point because I'd rather return to you pointing out the telephone game because you're so right. And what he does is he prefaces his talks these highly compensated lunchtime or evening talks with Israel in the crowd by saying, oh, so many people have tried to, talk about my life and they've done this. But there's a really easy solution to this. And some of that, to be fair, is actually true. Spielberg, in his way, tried to work off the autobiography. There's a Broadway play. I mean, let's step back for a minute. There is a Broadway play. High school students put on plays about this guy's life or what they think to be his life. There's a really simple solution out of this. Mr. Abagnale just has to go to the podium and say, hey, you know what? I didn't do those things. I never passed the Louisiana bar exam. I never worked for the Attorney General. Yes, I did dress as a pilot for a couple months. Prior to that, I was in prison in my youth. I just feel like the whole thing could be turned if he would just simply go to the podium and pull the Band-Aid off and say, hey, I also really regret, not just to say, because a vague, hey, I wish I hadn't done some of the things I did. No, like he has yet publicly to talk about what happened in Baton Rouge in 1969 to Bud and Charlotte Parks. And maybe it for many, it's like, oh, that was an old case in 69. But again, if you understand what happens to victims of that, it may not be physical violence, but Charlotte Parks was quoted in the newspaper years later as saying she doesn't trust people as much anymore. And I think it's reasonable for any reasonable person could understand why she would say that. So again, the remedy here to the telephone game is just to simply go up and say, hey, so many of the things I said at the talks at Google are false. This is a mature man. This is someone that's in his 70s. And only just recently, during the pandemic, had done a large talk to students throughout the world. This was put on for university students. A professor invited him to speak. And the first thing that he said out of the gates was, he was a Pan Am pilot for 2 years. He was a doctor in a Georgia hospital, and that he passed the Louisiana State Bar exam. So it's just, in my opinion, it's time. I think it's just time, and then let people enjoy the film as fiction would be my sense on it. But, and just really quickly on the movie, I'll add, because I know, when NPR did their story on this, a lot of people were really, really happy to say, hey, it's fiction. I still enjoy the movie. And I think that's great. So there's just one little aspect of it that even as fiction kind of, bothers me a little bit. And that is Abagnale's mother. Because if you step back and think about the way anybody familiar with the movie knows that she was presented as someone who was a gold digger, someone that was willing to sleep around on her husband. And I just thought that was a really unfair characterization. His mother wrote a letter when Abagnale was arrested at 20 years old in Baton Rouge. His mother really wrote a very loving and impassioned letter about what she had been through and the efforts that she tried to make to help out her son. And when I read that letter and she described what she had tried to do, I just thought it was really sad the way that she was depicted in the film. That's just me. Again, it wasn't my mother, but when I looked at the letter, I'm like, man, this is just not compatible with how she was depicted.
So in anticipation of you coming onto the show, I thought it would be only fair to reach out to Mr. Abagnale myself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I sent him an email a few days ago inviting him to come on. And he did respond to me almost immediately. It was polite, but very short. The email says, Dear Mr. Rivinus, thank you for the invitation. I am aware of Mr. Logan's book. However, I have not read the book. But from what I understand, it is not worthy of a comment. And that was it.
Okay. Well, you know what? That really, Eric, I'm really pleased. You're doing this exactly how it should be done. I'm presenting facts that I've gathered. I've also, formulated some of my own commentary and opinions, and I think it's only fitting that Mr. Abagnale be afforded that opportunity. And other news outlets have done the same thing. So what you received is directly in line with what NPR received as well. That Mr. Abagnale was contacted by NPR about the book content, and it's almost a carbon copy. He told them that it was not worthy of comment, which sounds precisely the same as yours. So I really appreciate that you did that. I wouldn't want it any other way, because that just shows your own ethics and your own integrity, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, thank you. It would have been nice, and for you as well, I'm sure. It would have been great to get you both together even in an active conversation.
100%. And who knows, that may happen at some time in the future. I'm not in this because I think, the man's a monster. And not at all. That's not why I'm in this. I'm in this because upon learning the Parks family, I thought, you know what, this needs to be told, and it needs to be told within the context of what the documentary evidence show from the police, court, U.S. National Archives, Swedish National Archives, French National Archives records show, as well as other documentation that I've been able to pull together. So that's how the Parks family story needed to be set. And a lot of the material, again, is based on reporting. So, I tip my hat to the journalists. I've mentioned Stephen Hall. I've mentioned Ira Perry. I think I'd be remiss if I did not mention Fayette Tompkins down in Baton Rouge, who worked for the State Times, which then became the Advocate. So a lot of the stories were actually written by Fayette Tompkins, who just did a really brilliant job of journalism and capturing the Parks story in 1981, when Abagnale went to a highly publicized talk regaling the students at Tulane University. The other thing that really wasn't mentioned here throughout the process is that the foreword to the book was written by Mark Zinder, who was Abagnale's manager during the heyday of his rapid rise with the book launch, his autobiography launch in 1980. And that's, he really was able to provide some interesting color commentary to the book as well. But Fayette Tompkins deserves mention. And then lastly, and I think this is just so important for listeners who may be interested. Again, I started by really focusing in on the Parks story. And if people want to learn more about that, rather than even going to thegreatesthoax.com, I would encourage people to go to Tom Aswell's website. Tom Aswell is a journalist in Louisiana. He's just a legend down in southern Louisiana. And he's done 2 articles on this on his Louisiana Voice website. And what he's done is he's actually embedded the newspaper articles from the time. So you can actually see on the Louisiana Voice website the stories about Abagnale and the Parks family. So that it's not just sort of Alan Logan saying this. I mean, I've got all of the Baton Rouge Police Department records were amazing. They're so thick. It's a huge, thick file. I have that. Of course, I've got the court records. But I would really encourage listeners to go to Tom Aswell's Louisiana Voice website and go and look at the newspaper articles that he's gathered, as well as interviews with various people, so that you can actually see some of these stories, for yourself if you're a listener, and check it out. All you have to do is type in Louisiana Voice Abagnale. We'll take you right there. There's 2 of them. And they actually talk about Paula Parks reuniting with Abagnale in February of 2020, and then a more recent piece as well. But Tom Aswell is a trusted journalist with tremendous experience, and you can see some of those articles there.
It seems like one of the things that he's tried to do is to make himself look like a successful criminal instead of an unsuccessful criminal.
Yeah, without question. Well, and I totally agree with you, Eric. There is a name for that. There are scientists and physicians really in the early 1900s, and then really through the mid-century. There was tremendous writings on what was called mythomania. And folks with mythomania would make up these stories. And a lot of times they would gain them notoriety and publicity. A lot of times they were profitable. And then when called out, much the way for years Mr. Abagnale claimed that he escaped through the toilet in the airplane, and then at the talks at Google, because aeronautical engineers said it was impossible, he kind of backed off it. That's characteristic of the mythomaniac. And to be fair, and I say this in the book, I actually wonder to what extent will Mr. Abagnale be liberated from all of this? There, at least the opportunity is there. That let me put it that way, because the story was constructed in Houston in 1976, premiered, if you will, at the Galveston County Chamber of Commerce in 1977, which is, again, the first large, any piece of media that told the story, including the airline toilet escape, and as I mentioned, the 2,000 decals and Pan Am checks and all manner of stuff. But once that's sort of baked into the cake, how do you undo it? So I think a lot of this stuff was made up conveniently. And was it for profit initially? It's not for me to say. I can't say that. But it was made up regardless, whether it was just for personal attention. In the letters to Reverend Underwood in 1969 to the Parks family, he concedes that he always felt he needed to be a fake in order to get people to pay attention. So it may not have nothing to do with profit and collecting a reported $20,000 paycheck to give a talk, about his life. It's just speculation on my part. I like to kind of, if possible, just go look at where the facts at and who is missing. So the book, The Greatest Hoax on Earth, I think Paula Parks and Mark Zinder, his former manager, I think they set the table really nicely, because they're basically saying, hey, this is a book about the other people in this story. Because the thing about Catch Me If You Can, the film, and this has been acknowledged by every person who reviewed it in the major media outlets, it's kind of a victimless movie, right? I mean, when the guy's ripping off large corporations, banks, and Pan Am, who are the victims really? Yes, it's victims of deception, but it's like one of those neuroscientists, the images what neuroscientists use, where you just tweak the image ever so slightly, or if you look at it in a different way, if you sort of take your eyes off of focus, a different image appears. You can describe the events of Baton Rouge in 1969, where someone dresses up in a costume, uses false pretenses to find out where a woman's job is going to be finishing, her day's work, then moves into their family home, steals checks from them, and you can really make that image appear very differently. And I think any reasonable person, Paula Parks says that she felt uncomfortable with the whole thing. She was following everything I've just now mentioned. A reasonable person could easily say, wow, that is really, really bad. So, again, I think Paula needs a voice too, and others as well. And I tried to do that.
That makes sense. I like the movie a lot. Like a lot of people like the movie. But I have to say that the part in the film that made me a little uncomfortable, and it still does whenever I see the film, I mean, I've seen it a few times, is when he assumes the identity of a doctor. That could easily have gone terribly wrong. I don't think that is a victimless crime, betraying the trust of patients who really believe that you are a real doctor.
Yeah, well, thankfully, based on available records, we don't think that happened. Now, Paul Holson, the aforementioned mature student at the University of Arizona who wrote his memoirs called Born in a Bottle of Beer, he was the guy that showed up at the recruitment effort at the University of Arizona. I confirmed that he was a student there. I went back and I got the yearbook, and he's in there. And if his memoirs are true, he claimed in the memoir that Abagnale was playing doctor as well as recruiting. So I don't want to get into speculation about Holson's book. That's his book, not mine. That is something that, again, if you take Holson at his word, that's, something that I think would also change the perception of, beautiful women arm in arm with Leonardo DiCaprio. What are the facts? So I think there's a lot more that meets the eye, but Abagnale has, through one way or another, embedded himself into Pan Am culture. You can go on Google right now. You can look at Google Images. You'll see Abagnale highly associated with the glamour of Pan American Airlines. It's just, part of it. There was a huge display at the National Crime Museum that had Abagnale's many claimed exploits in there. But there's also sort of an educational component of this, that's worth talking about. We're living in the misinformation age. I didn't even get into that, but I think any reasonable listener can understand that we're really at a point of a misinformation crisis in North America. And I think it's really important that we consider critical appraisal skills and the notion that extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. If I said that, listen, I painted myself with an invisible, serum and stowed away on the Apollo, and there was a big, long Wikipedia page about me doing that, and at the bottom it said, NASA disputes these claims. Well, that's kind of where we're at with this. And I think it's really important that critical appraisal skills come into play. And if you step back and think about it, in the absence of strong evidence, those are some pretty wild claims. And I think that's part of it. Keep in mind, this story has been cemented into criminal justice textbooks. There's even a study guide that accompanies the book for university students. It's really kind of incredible when you see the lengths to which this story in the claimed version has embedded itself into so many aspects, even of teaching. And that also concerns me, that it's in textbooks for university students as claimed to be true, not speculation or he claimed he did this, but actually reciting it as if it's fact. So there's also that larger contextual component to this discourse. And, I'm hoping that at least it's out there and we can have, broader discussions about this, as in its context. If the film itself is regaled throughout the world, not every single journalist was buying into it, though. I have to say that. There were some naysayers, and that also pertains to his autobiography, where certain journalists who looked, these are, book critics, who looked at the autobiography. One of the women who was the book critic for the Los Angeles Times called it self-serving. Another, really approached its misogynistic tone. And, again, where does this sit into culture? That's a larger discussion.
Right. Well, thank you for taking some time to share what you've discovered. It's been extremely interesting.
Really appreciate it, Eric. Thanks for doing, what you're doing, bring, stories to light. And just to repeat, I really, really appreciate the fact that you tried to approach this, story with ethics and integrity. And I salute you for that.
Thank you.
All right, my friend.
Again, I have been speaking to Alan C. Logan. His book is called The Greatest Hoax on Earth, Catching Truth While We Can. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.